And good morning, good afternoon to everyone once again. Welcome to Cisco ISE Operations Strategies and Best Practices. My name is Jamie Sanbower. I'm going to be your host for today. I'm also joined by a host of different modern cyber folks that are going to help us go through today's session. Also, they're going to be helping me monitor the Q&A. So we do want to keep things interactive. Love to get your feedback, love to get your questions asked and answered as we go through. So kicking things off, just brief introductions. Again, my name's Jamie. I am joined by Tina Klein, Jeff Hatchell, as well as Uzi, who will be helping me manage kind of the Q&A, as well as helping bridge some of those verbal questions. If you do have a question, please drop it into the Q&A panel, or you can raise your hand if you would like to verbally ask the question. We're going to be taking questions throughout the session, as well as hopefully we'll have a few minutes at the end as well to open it up for any and all questions. So one of the things that I wanted to kick things off with is, why are we here today? What is kind of the challenges associated with operations? And in many cases, we've worked with many different customers around the world where we've helped them deploy. And then after we get finished a actual deployment or implementation, a lot of things start to come up pretty consistently across different verticals, customers, and environments. And more specifically, one of the key things that we're going to tackle today is kind of these top three items that tend to be a pretty difficult challenge for many organizations to address. The first one is new use cases. Now, in general, many IT organizations, they have current state, what they have out there from a user device standpoint, and that's changing all the time. We're going to get into how to deal with that, how it creates some challenges, and how you can address those. One of my favorites / things that keep me up at night is keeping everything up to date, keeping the solution updated. So we're going to talk through things like software upgrades and patches and some best practices there. And then the final one is access to ISE expertise, whether it's building your team out, whether it's working with other partners or engineering firms, or it's just trying to level set your organization's experience and expertise with ISE. We're going to hit those in multiple levels. Now, from an agenda standpoint, I wanted to kind of kick things off on the operations side with initial deployment, because quite honestly, a lot of the challenges we end up seeing in operations start with either mistakes or potential issues in the deployment methodology that could have been solved earlier on. Then I'll take you through a few certificate best practices, software upgrades and patches. We'll talk through some of those new use cases, and then hit some of the optimization of policies and enhanced security. And then we'll close things out talking a little bit about enabling ISE engineers. So to kick things off, I wanted to talk about deployments by themselves, because when we're talking about operations and best practices, as mentioned, a lot of the things that we end up running into start from the initial deployment. And one fun Benjamin Franklin quote that I appreciate quite a bit: "An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure." Now, for those of you that are not based in the US or do not live in the US, maybe only peripheral heard of Benjamin Franklin, this quote essentially is getting to the crux of it, which is, in some cases, it's a lot easier to prevent those challenges in advance than it is to actually tackle them after the fact. And with ISE deployments specifically, I will say a lot of those issues actually come from the initial deployment. So let's break down some of the high-level areas within an ISE deployment methodology where some of these issues might occur. And the number one on the left-hand side is really requirements. And this one is tough. Why is it tough? Because we have business requirements. I need my employees to be able to do X, Y, and Z. We've got technical requirements. My organization should have least privilege access controls to users and devices. We also have operational requirements. Things like my help desk needs to be enabled so that they can find where an employee or a device is actually located in the network so that they can help diagnose whether it's a network connectivity issue, an application issue, etc. And the last one on the list here that I think most people kind of forget about is future requirements. I've seen it many times in ISE deployments where we go through in detail all of the requirements for the organization, what they define as a successful deployment. And then 6 months, 12 months later, we start talking to them again about how the deployment's going, et cetera. And they add 3 or 4 requirements that they already knew about back when the deployment occurred, but they were never articulated or talked about. And in some cases, I'll give you one favorite example. Hey, we're starting the deployment out. We're going to do the easy stuff first, wired, wireless, 802.1x, and that's it. Down the road, customer decides, hey, we would like to adopt BYOD. Well, how would that affect my initial deployment? Well, immediately, if they want to use the My Devices portal, they might need a different certificate or subject alternative name on that certificate. So what was something that could have been just a few extra steps within the initial deployment now is an entire maintenance window, a lot of planning, and a lot of human labor to go behind that change in requirement. So one practical tip here is making sure that even if you're not doing it during the initial deployment, you're still understanding from a deployment standpoint, what are those future goals? Are you trying to implement segmentation, additional use cases? All of these things can actually sway a design decision or actually sway the way you might implement or configure ISE during the initial deployment. And far too often, folks kind of miss out on those opportunities because they're just not really thinking about, well, hey, in the future, I want to do X, Y, and Z requirements. And how is that going to affect the initial versus the ongoing operations environment? Now, from a design standpoint, one other big thing that happens is HA and scale. Some of these things are not hard rules that are written down. One example I always like to give is from a ISE design standpoint, we're going to scale things based on concurrent endpoints. So how many endpoints are going to be in the overall deployment, as well as authenticating to specific policy services nodes or radius servers. And in those cases, you also have some limitations around authentications per second. So there's little details in that design process that make a big difference, whether you're authenticating to on-prem Active Directory server, a cloud identity server, or potentially even an on-prem CMDB, for example, as an external repository. The other piece to this is documentation. Far too often, you'll find a lot of implementers during the initial deployment. They get in, they start building VMs, they start building ISE, they talk through what they need to integrate, and they just configure things. Now, at the end of the day, that is a viable method, but if you're not documenting what the current state is, what the target state is, it's very difficult for any organization to make further changes in the future, as well as validate that those initial requirements and the design stands up to what you're trying to accomplish. And that kind of brings us into testing and test plans specifically. As you go through an initial deployment, you should have all of those requirements. You should design the ISE policies to meet the use cases and requirements associated with that deployment. And then the final step there should be, I need a way of actually validating that what is configured and deployed matches up to that initial requirements and design. And that's where a good test plan comes in play here. And more specifically, a lot of people get wrapped around detailed test plans, and 75 pages later, they've got a test plan that meets every requirement. In general, the best tip you can have is start to build test plans in a way that not only are you going to use them to validate your initial deployment and configuration, but it also can be used in the future for things like upgrades. After I upgrade a system, what am I going to test to make sure that everything still works? So that test plan is a key component. I do see a lot of organizations kind of be more informal about it. Hey, users able to connect to wired, they're able to connect to wireless. Great. Let's move on to deployment. Well, if we haven't addressed all of the use cases, there is a potential where configure something else, it breaks the old use cases. Now, once we've done a locked-in design, a lot of it gets into the initial deployment where you're going to configure the baseline node and ISE deployment or cluster. You're going to configure all the policies and adopt all of the use cases. From there, that's where you get into detailed testing. One of the biggest mistakes we see here is I've got a lab, I've got wired and wireless, and I'm testing those use cases within ISE in a great way. But I'm not actually addressing the different combinations of network access devices. If you're an organization that has 5 different models of switches, for example, and on those 5 models, you have 6 different software versions running, you have a lot of different device types and combinations to test out. Just because something works great on a Catalyst 9300 that's in the lab doesn't mean it's going to work on your older 3850 that you haven't replaced yet. The other thing is getting a good baseline of the different device types that are within the environment. Now, if you have a device that's very specific, you only have 2 or 3 of them across the entire organization, probably not something you're going to bring in as a primary test case. But things like the managed workstations, Windows, Mac, Linux, mobile devices, iOS and Android, being able to test things like IP phones, printers, and access points. Those majority device types, so the big bulk of devices within the enterprise environment, should go through a validation test to make sure everything works as expected and designed. Now, from there, once you've done that detailed testing, everything becomes a little bit easier. You can move into a production pilot where you're testing both wired, wireless, VPN potentially, and be able to validate that everything works in the environment the way it worked in the lab. We also then would move into things like doing a migration for existing wired environments, wireless LANs or SSIDs that are within the environment, and then a question around how do I migrate in a way that's not going to affect my existing users and devices in a negative way. And one big tip here is, do you have a safety net? When you're initially migrating, there's multiple ways you can configure ISE as a solution to help with limiting the risk of migration. Number one that you've probably heard about is what we call open mode. You can enable on a wired device the ability for the switch to try to authenticate a user device. If it isn't able to, it will open up the port. The biggest downside to that approach is then after you're ready to move from that open to a controlled or a closed mode, as we like to call it, you immediately have to go touch every switch. Now, if you only have 50 switches, probably not a big deal. If you have 100 switches, 1,000 switches, starts to become a pretty big intensive project in of itself if you don't have something for automation there. The other alternative is to leverage ISE policies in a fail open manner so that you can create that same level of safety net. One example I'll give you was working with a customer who had a CMDB. Every MAC address that was owned by that organization was in their CMDB. And they were very proud of that, and as they should, because keeping an up-to-date CMDB can be challenging for some. But what did that give us? That gave us a great safety net to basically say, hey, if we don't authenticate or authorize any MAC address that's in this long list of our approved devices, then let's go ahead and allow them on in a temporary fashion. And I can also pull reports directly out of ISE that gives me that list so I can maintain or change that around. And then the last part of the deployment itself is day zero support and further support. So day zero is right after you cut over, making sure that all the users, devices, and use cases are effectively working within the environment. And then you have to think about things like transfer ISE to the existing operations areas. So if you're doing, as an organization, things like proactive service monitoring and service management, this is the right spot to insert, or I'll say promote, ISE into a production service. And at the same time, you should have established procedures and standard operating procedures, or SOPs, around day one support. Those SOPs should include things like the common issues. If someone calls up to the help desk and they're not able to get online, either through wired or wireless, what are the questions the help desk is going to ask? How can they validate very quickly whether or not it is a endpoint issue, a policy issue, or an ISE issue? So these things a lot of times are kind of skipped over or not looked at in a way that's going to help with the long-term serviceability of ISE as a solution. And one big challenge we run into with ISE specifically is it can do a lot of different things. Many organizations have been working with Cisco Secure ACS for many years, and they transitioned over to ISE for device administration or TACX use cases. So I know there's well over 50, 60,000 different deployments out there that are doing a level of device administration. That's just one of many different use cases that ISE can do for a customer. Now, during that initial deployment, one thing that does come up is, like I gave you the earlier story, what happens when we're not kind of aligning use cases, requirements, and design to the actual implementation? Now, I know this is a very ugly, ugly photo, but I feel like it does represent some of the ISE configurations that I've walked into without any prior knowledge, and a few others. Now, how does something get to this bad? Typically, it's because of a lack of design and requirements gathering prior to implementation. So in that example where I said someone shows up, they start to build things out, they configure a use case at a time, they go back to the team, say, what else do we need to make work? At the end of the configuration sessions, this is what they wind up with, which is functional in a sense, but at the same time, I don't know about you, but I don't find this architecture very usable or maintainable. Now, how do we fix this? In way too many cases, there's a lack of documentation for deployments. If you're an organization where you're already deployed with ISE, you should have some level of, at a bare minimum, high-level design documented. And Cisco does provide a template for you to do this. It helps you document the business objectives, environments, the different scenarios, use cases, the policy detail, as well as other components like ops and management and the scale and HA. So one big tip here is make sure you at least have that baseline of a high-level design. In a perfect world, if you worked with a partner or a contractor to help build ISE, there should be a low-level design that details out the entire details of the configuration and deployment there. Now, outside of just getting the requirements design correct so that you're able to implement in a strategic way where the configuration makes sense, it's manageable, etc., here are some of the other common mistakes that the ModernCyber team consistently sees while working with different customers. In one case, top of this list, one of the big things is during that initial deployment, working with experienced ISE engineers. Now, I'm not saying it has to be a third-party person from your organization, but having someone on staff that's actually done real-world deployments, that understands some of the gotchas and can help steer you in the correct direction is extremely important. Other things, since I did mention requirements and design so much, one of the reasons why some of these things turn out this way, it's not on purpose. No one's going to go about in a deployment or configuration and say, let me just configure this thing in the worst possible way and have to add things, and it becomes unmanageable. What typically happens here is we'll capture requirements from the network team, but we're not actually going out to the full IT organization and the diverse different IT groups that all might have different requirements from an ISE deployment standpoint. More specifically, you go out and talk to the help desk. Well, what is their requirements? Do they need to be able to understand the level of ACLs applied to the session? Do they need to know wireless performance along with just the access control result? What does the desktop team think as far as how they would like to authenticate devices? Are they in the process of migrating all their devices to TPM-supported workstations that are going to have TPM-stored certificates? Well, that would be really good to know that they're in the process of doing that prior to deploying ISE. Same thing goes with some of the other teams managing things like patch management, mobile device management, etc. Now, the other one I know is a little bit difficult to quantify, but making bad design decisions. So one of the things that we personally try to do quite a bit is help organizations understand those design choices and the capabilities before they make those decisions. And a lot of times they're making, let's say, a decision about how they want to approach guest access. You've got 3 different options. We can do a hotspot portal. We can do sponsored guest access. We can do sponsor or self-registration with validation. So there's a lot of different options there. What would drive an organization to choose one or the other? Well, there's a laundry list of pros and cons to each approach, and depending on vertical, industry, and how they would like to deal with use cases like guest is going to be very organization specific. So making sure that before you go into that deployment, you have the appropriate knowledge to make some of these decisions. And if not, if you are working with another organization, make sure there's some level of design knowledge transfer. How am I supposed to decide if I want to place a policy services node all centrally or distribute them without understanding the ramifications of that design decision? The one in red here is lack of consistency. Now, I brought this up in a basic way, which is, hey, I've got 5 different types of switches and 6 different software versions across each type of switch serviced out within my organization. That's a lot of different variables to test to make sure it's going to work. So without consistency in the hardware and software versions of your network access devices, it is 100% still possible, but you need to understand that variable because it might work differently on a different model or even a different software version. The other big one is lack of consistency in policy. Now, I wrote down here different policy. Some organizations start to get into having controls that are widely different if a user is connecting to wired, wireless, VPN. In a lot of cases, that is legacy. It comes from those individual access methods having different security controls. So a lot of times it is important to take the time during a deployment to decide, well, what is the future for the organization? Is there going to be consistency in how we treat a user that connects to wired versus wireless? Are we going to have a difference in a user's experience if they're connecting with a personal versus a corporate managed machine? And then the final common mistake that we see quite frequently with ISE is ISE used to fix IT issues. Now, you got to be thinking, fix IT issues? What do you mean? My favorite example is ISE posture and compliance. So for many, many years, you have organizations that use things like Microsoft SCCM or a patch management tool like IBM BigFix. And in some of those cases, I'll stick with Microsoft SCCM as an example, many organizations would have a certain percentage of hosts that Microsoft SCCM just wasn't working correctly. So let's call it 20, 30% of their devices weren't getting their patches that they needed to be an up-to-date device. And in that case, they wanted ISE to somehow fix that experience and stop everyone. If you're missing patches, let's get you up to date before you actually get access to the network. Now, I don't know about you, but is it my problem as an employee that your patch management solution is not working in the intended fashion? And should I have to lose out on 10 minutes, 20 minutes? Sometimes these patches can take an hour to install and reboot the machine. Should I have to lose that productivity as an employee? Does the business want to lose that productivity as for all employees if these types of issues occur? So this is one of many examples. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. So when we're thinking about ISE as a tool, if it can do it, ask yourself the question, is this going to be a good experience or bad experience for the end user base? There's been way too many times where organizations have used something like Posture, then ended up having to turn it off because they weren't implementing it in a way that was transparent and good for the end user community. Now I wanted to pause here. Any questions so far coming in through the chat or Q&A?
Yeah, Jamie, we did get one question come in through QA around migrating ISE from SNS to a VM environment, and what steps or kind of overarching prerequisites would need to take place before making that migration to VM?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So in a lot of cases, when we're looking at an existing deployment, first, the motivator has to be there, right? So the steps that we would typically go through for a migration like that is to evaluate, okay, why are we moving from SNS to VM? Is it the device is end of life and you've started to invest more in the VM environment and have the capacity? If so, great. Check the prerequisites off the list. Then you have to make the decision of how you want to build the new deployment. Is this something where you're going to take everything in the existing deployment and move it over? Are you going to have new IP addressing and new host names? If that's the case, then you're going to start to think about what are the other things that have to change in the configuration, like certificates, DNS records, etc., to support it. And then you would plan out, in many cases, you would want to build a parallel deployment so that you can fully build it up while the other one is servicing production, and then essentially be able to move all radius authentications from the old or legacy deployment onto the new deployment. Now, in some cases, that could require switch or wireless LAN controller radius server settings changes. In some cases, if you're using something like a load balancer, it's a simple load balancer configuration change to make the migration occur. But in general, I think it's going to follow a lot of these same best practices from an initial deployment standpoint, meaning you're going to want to do the due diligence from a documentation standpoint. You're going to want to test. You're going to want to make sure everything works both before and after that migration. But thank you very much for the question. So next up, let's talk a little bit about certificates, because this is a common issue that happens all the time. If some of the vendors out there like Google got their way, all certificates would expire after 90 days. So while this problem today mostly is a once a year, I need to make sure I'm maintaining my publicly signed certificates and certificates on ISE, this could very well become a more frequent endeavor in the future. Now, just to give a good level set on how certificates are used in ISE, one, it's a critical part of almost every service within ISE as a deployment. So normally, the first question I ask when a customer tells me ISE stopped working, no user is able to authenticate, is what happened to your certs or what happened to Active Directory or your authentication server? 9 times out of 10, it ends up being one of those two things. When everything worked one day and then the next day it stopped working. The only third I would put into that list is NTP, because both Active Directory and certificates use time as a way of validating that the authentication is successful. With that said, let's take a look at some of the key certificate functions within ISE. Number one is going to be for 802.1x itself. So any supplicant that's connecting into the network, wired or wireless, essentially is going to have to send credentials. In order to send those credentials, you need to establish a level of trust. So essentially with that EAP authentication, it creates a tunnel from the supplicant or end user or device to the ISE server. That EAP authentication will then be tunneled in that EAP tunnel and allow for appropriate privacy associated with the interconnection or the credentials that go across that tunnel. Now we also have TLS for BYOD sessions and any type of security between the network access device like a switch or wireless LAN controller and ISE itself. So Radius DTLS does establish a TLS tunnel as well. So the switch or wireless LAN controller needs to trust ISE's server in order for this to work. If we're using integrations through PXGrid, both internally to an ISE deployment, as well as integrations with both Cisco and third-party devices, rely on TLS and those certificates to authenticate and protect those sessions and sharing of information. Now, in many cases, some organizations might opt to use ISE's built-in certificate authority, especially for use cases like BYOD or PXGrid, because those certificates are more specific to ISE interactions, and there might not be other use cases where those certificates are used. So it makes perfect sense to leverage that CA, be able to keep both the certificate generation and management on ISE for those connecting clients. In the case of things like BYOD, we also support SCAP, which does require certificate trust as well of that external service. So this would be helping a BYOD device get a certificate from an internal CA, for example. The other certificate that you're probably more familiar with is the ISE admin certificate. This is the certificate that protects the web UI. More specifically, if you're an administrator logging into the administrative node within the ISE deployment, there is a certificate that protects the TLS SSL within the session. Now, also we see cert use in things like SAML connections and all of our portals that we might utilize for use cases like guest, BYOD, or posture provisioning, client provisioning, etc. Now, one other key thing to note here is within the certificates themselves, there is a need to understand what the trust or names associated with the different nodes are. So there's a lot of design decisions as part of the initial deployment where you choose things like, do I want to use a shared certificate across my PSNs? So I have one EAP certificate with multiple subject alternative names, or a wildcard that can essentially help me scale. But in general, you're not going to get away from understanding and maintaining the certificates within your ISE deployment. With that said, a couple best practices / tips that I wanted to leave you behind with. Do not let certificates expire. I have had a few people make that mistake. I won't say it's too much. I'm sure if we had a Cisco TAC engineer on the phone, they would tell you this is a very constant thing that does occur. So cert expires, more specifically, the EAP certificate expired, equals no network access. You can't say it any clearer. If you forget about this problem, it will come back to bite you. And one of an old colleague of mine used to always say, save the surprises for birthday parties, not for IT and tech. So in this case, save the surprise for the birthday party. So we don't want this to be a surprise day where we come in, no one can get online. So in order to alleviate that from ever happening and reduce the risk, enable alarm email notifications. You can also do syslog notifications if you're not a big email fan. A lot of times that syslog can then generate things like help desk tickets so that people are proactively seeing those notifications. And then also just a general best practice, note the expiry date during initial deployment or any type of certificate replacement, and put the placeholder in the calendar. Unfortunately, I've said this to many people before, and they kind of, Jamie, your voice is kind of monotone, and I didn't catch that, or I forgot to put it in my calendar, and needless to say, they learned the hard way. Now, the other tip that are not as clear for many organizations is, as a part of ISE backups, you'll actually notice within the documentation, the backups do not contain the private keys of the certificates. So a big best practice here is to also make sure you're exporting and securely storing both public and private keys in case of a node failure within the environment, or potential upgrade failure, etc. Now, this has caught a few organizations in the past, especially if you're generating a certificate signing request directly from ISE. When you do that, the private key got created on ISE, it sits on ISE, it's not in that backup. So you need to make sure you have that backed up, ready to go if you do need to restore it. The other thing that's important here is be ready for changes. In some cases, I've seen entire root certificate chains change for different CAs. So even when you go out and do a certificate renewal, make sure the chain hasn't changed. I know that's a lot of C's, certificate chain changing. Make sure that chain hasn't changed, because if so, you need to make sure that both ISE and any connected clients do still trust the certificate itself and the chain associated with it. It's just one little tidbit that has been myself personally in the past that I wanted to bring up there. The other one that can occur is, think about if you're going to be renaming, adding, removing certificates or ISE nodes. One thing that does happen with some organizations is they might start with 2 ISE PSNs and they decide, hey, we'd like to grow the deployment out because we're gonna, we started with wireless, now we're adding wired as a use case. We need to add 2 more ISE PSNs. If you're using a shared certificate across your PSNs, most likely, unless you have a wildcard certificate, you're going to have to go through and update those certificates. If your organization has rebranded, you created a brand new domain name, that is something where you would have cert maintenance that needs to be done if you're changing DNS, IP addresses, or the actual host names themselves. Now, if you are the person who is responsible for ISE certs, there are 2 or 3 now good webinars that the ISE technical marketing engineers within the Cisco business unit have put on. If you haven't checked out the ISE YouTube channel, it's definitely a recommended view. But there is a nice deep dive hour on certificates and management and operations, all for you to kind of digest and understand. So many of these tips and tricks you'll find sprinkled throughout, along with additional details like, how do you actually change those certs out? How are you going to create a wildcard cert versus a regular cert? If you're using a load balancer, how should I make that work? With that, any questions about certificates coming in to the chat Q&A?
Yeah, so we did have one come in earlier. In general, do you suggest administrators use the BYOD feature? And if so, do you normally recommend public certs for assigning certs? Or do you normally steer clients to use their MDM deployments for BYOD access?
So it's a great question. Unfortunately, I don't think it's a black and white answer as far as what the right approach there is. So we personally, I will say, done it both ways. So for BYOD, there's a lot of supported ways to distribute the certificates, everything from using ISE BYOD client provisioning, which can use ISE's internal CA, or use ISE's certificate proxy and SCEP capabilities for an external CA. I've also worked with many customers where they have a third-party MDM and they would like to use that for BYOD provisioning. So they'd like to leverage their Meraki Systems Manager or Microsoft Intune or Jamf, for example, to be able to onboard and assign certificates to those BYOD devices. So there's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all approach there, but in general, public signing of those certs for BYOD is not a typical thing that we see. Why? Because even if it's a certificate signing cert that you've purchased, a lot of times that is more money, and sometimes there is a direct cost associated with the public sign cert on the client side. Now, in general, if ISE is assigning that cert and it's privately signed, do we really care that it's not publicly signed coming from the client? Not really. In general, we can still ensure that it is the user that they say they are and the device is appropriate to be connecting to that medium. But great question there. So next up, software upgrades and patches. This one has haunted a few organizations. I will say a couple practical tips here. One, ISE suggested release used to be referred to as the recommended release. You'll still hear me say recommended. In general, being an ex-Cisco person myself, I know I was a part of a lot of these conversations when the recommended release was originally done. And what you'll notice is a recommended release is something that the business unit, the developers, TAC, as well as the feedback from different customers and partners has all actually attributed to calling this a recommended release. So what you'll notice is it becomes a good target for most deployments. And in general, I would be happy to state normal best practice here, go with recommended release unless there is some feature or reason that you're not going to go to that version or patch version. One example would be, in this case, today, as we sit here, the recommended release is ISE 3.3 patch 4. If I was working with a customer or we were doing a deployment and there was a specific feature in ISE 3.4 that was required for that deployment, then we might utilize ISE 3.4 because there's no way to incorporate that feature into 3.3. Otherwise, I'm going to stick with the recommended release. In general, the other best practice is don't be that person that's ready to install the latest software the day it comes out. Let some other organizations try this thing out. Like I mentioned, a lot of cases, TAC will be able to monitor those releases. And once it's hitting the right amount of cases or seen with no issues and a certain amount of adoption, that's when they move it to the suggested release, which makes most organizations feel a lot more comfortable. You aren't the first one to try this. For the most practical use cases, this is going to be the best software version that you can start with. Now, ISE patches. This is something that most, if you have been operating ISE for a while, do understand that exist. And ISE patches are released pretty semi-regularly. Depending on the year, there's been as frequent as every month or every other month during high security vulnerability times. And then more recently, I'll say there's less bugs and security vulnerabilities, so patches are coming out every few months or every handful of months. So with that said, normally as an organization who's maintaining and operating ISE, you're going to focus on applying patches at least once a year outside of your upgrade cycle. In general, a lot of times it might be twice a year. So one other piece of advice here with patches, you can do it two ways, either via the CLI, where you're individually upgrading each individual node. This does give you better visibility and control over the process because I can start, stop, I see all the output on the CLI. But in comparison, if you do use the GUI, which you can see in the screenshot on the right-hand side of the screen, it actually does the work for you. So if you have a distributed deployment, essentially hit the install button, give ISE the patch. ISE will go ahead and patch the primary pan first. then upgrade all the primaries, and then continue on within the secondaries. So the only downside outside of you not seeing immediate the status is going to be that lack of visibility. So I'm not seeing that status. I'm also not able to kind of monitor the steps without also going back to the CLI and viewing the logs in the log files. Now, outside of those patches, which are going to be great for bug fixes, vulnerability fixes, the other thing I should state, I was actually worked with a customer where they forgot to patch and their ISE deployment hadn't been rebooted in like 9 months, hadn't been patched, and essentially they ran into a memory issue where there was a memory bug that they didn't patch for. So essentially by not patching their deployment, they created a future outage. So I just want to give that as the example here of why I'm talking about patches, why it can be so important. If there's a critical bug or security vulnerability, you want to get that fixed up so it doesn't become a problem. And we have unfortunately seen that within certain organizations out there. Now, from an upgrade standpoint, essentially, here's a good methodology recommended from the Cisco business unit around the steps to take around upgrades. Choose your upgrade method, prepare for the upgrade, perform health check, do either full or split upgrade, perform the upgrade itself, and then perform post-upgrade tasks. Now, in general, there's 3 individual methods you can go through within upgrades. Backup and restore, essentially a method where you are taking the configuration backup and able to restore it to a brand new, freshly installed version of ISE. Now, in general, if you've done 15 upgrades because you started on ISE 1.0, a lot of times there might be files and leftover things from multiple versions over almost 15 years now. So being able to do a backup and restore is a great way to start fresh. You also have some great capabilities with the GUI-based upgrade. In general, over the past 4 to 5 years, this has been enhanced significantly. So if you went through a GUI upgrade 5 years ago and you haven't looked at that process again, you should check it out because they have, from a feature standpoint, made it very nice to be able to do things like split upgrades, control, the restarts, etc. And then also, as a final option, you can individually upgrade nodes from the CLI as well. So just like some of the other sections, some top upgrade tips, make sure you have a good ISE database backup and those certificates backed up. In general, I've seen it far too many times where someone doesn't check that latest backup. And even though the ISE upgrade checks will check for you, some people miss those details. Oh yeah, it has an upgrade or it has a backup file on it in our repository. That backup was taken 6 months ago. Well, everything that you've changed between 6 months ago and today, not going to be there in case you need it. The other big best practice here is leverage the upgrade readiness tool to estimate times in data migration. I've worked with some customers where they got frustrated after the fact. They started an upgrade on Friday night, and then Sunday night at 8 p.m. it's still going, and they don't know how they're going to finish in time for Monday morning when everyone comes back. The reason for that challenge was they didn't really understand how long it was going to take based on the current state. And it kind of leads us into the next bullet point, which is determining data retention. In that same customer's case that essentially had gone on for over 50 hours of upgrade time, they had a significant amount of operational data stored in the M&T database. For each record, it had to change that record over to the new schema and migrate it, those log records one by one. In their case, just by minimizing the operational data down to the last 7 days versus 30, 60, 90 days, they were able to cut the upgrade time down from over 50 hours down to less than 8 hours in their deployment. So something as simple as, do I need The logs from 30 days ago that tells me who logged in, or am I doing things like sending that syslog over to my SIM anyway? Do I have it in an operational backup where if I really needed to restore and get that data, I could? Then I don't necessarily need it in the database and have to migrate all that data during the upgrade. Another upgrade tip here, most people won't be as blunt as I am. You've probably learned that already now, but read the manual. So this is not your old school iOS upgrade where you get a binary, you take the old one off, you put the new one on, you reboot, and it just comes up. This is a large application, multi-node deployment. There's a lot of details around the upgrade process. What are the steps and what needs to take place in what order in order to be successful? If you look at the actual ISE upgrade journey documentation, this is a 68-page PDF. So if you look at that, plus the release notes, plus everything else, you really should be reviewing almost 157 pages if you're about to upgrade to ISE 3.4. Now, if you're from the Wild West and you like to live dangerously, that's not a way to treat IT. In general, you should be taking the due diligence time to understand what's happening there and what the process is. A lot of times, my favorite example, I'll go back to the one I just mentioned. That same customer that it took over 50 hours for their upgrade, and then they had to stop it manually and had all these problems after the fact. If they would have just read and taken the time to understand what was recommended, they would have understood that, hey, I run the upgrade readiness tool. It's going to tell me how long. It's going to tell me how much data. Now I have the data to go, okay, well, 72 hours is too long for someone to sit and wait. Let's go ahead and look at some of the alternatives. In their case, they actually moved reduced data and did the same upgrade. But in some cases, it might move you from going, I want to use the GUI or CLI method for upgrade to, I'm going to do a backup and restore and essentially be able to control the entire process. The last tip I have on this page is don't learn in production. I've seen this far too many times. Operator takes over, team's in place. You know, they've never done an ISE upgrade before, and they're kind of just figuring it out as they go on the production deployment. Not a good time to learn. How do we deal with that? And what is the recommendation there? You can practice in a lab. So essentially, one thing I haven't mentioned up to this point is on that cs.co/ISE-software, you can download the OVAs and ISO images. They come with a free 90-day license built in. This will allow you to build the VM, restore your most recent backup, perform the upgrade. Then you can even take a backup of that upgraded database just in case. And you can note while you're doing this in a lab environment, the upgrade procedure, the steps, and the length of each step. Now, this is a simple way to make sure that you're not missing anything and you don't bring down network access as a part of your ISE upgrade. Another tip and resource you can go to is this ISE Eternal Evaluation for your lab. This YouTube video shows you how to build those 90-day evals and continually build them over and over again in cloud if you want to do that. Now for the next topic, I want to talk a little bit about new use cases. Why? Because in general, if things stayed the same, this would be much easier for us. I wish we had a static environment and nothing ever changed. That's just not plausible or possible for 99.99% of organizations out there. You're going to get new device types, whether it be a new workstation model, a new printer model, a new IoT device. Who knows? It's going to be a smart widget that counts everybody as they walk past a cubicle, for example. Who knows? The bottom line is we're always going to have new device types. This problem is not growing smaller, it's growing larger. Many lines of businesses are looking at devices that can help them do their jobs better. You also find new network devices. Hey, we're going to upgrade our wireless from this version to this version, new access points, new controller. We're going to move from Catalyst wireless to cloud managed wireless with Meraki. How is that going to change? New types of gas contractors, new policies. or even changed integrated products. All of these new things that are changing can create some issues. One of the examples I'll give you is how you deal with new IoT devices. This is probably the most common one, but you should be thinking about a standard operating procedure within your IT organization on how to deal with these new use cases and devices with ISE. Because if a organization or a line of business within your organization goes out and buys 50 new widgets, you got to be able to provide wired or wireless access. So here's a good framework just to get you started. You should be asking that purchaser, how many devices? Is there central management? Does it support 802.1x or not? Is it going to connect to the network via wired or wireless or some form of LTE connectivity? And what is the make, model, and software version? With that information, then you can kind of look at, well, what is the appropriate way to support this new device type? Am I going to have to create a new custom profile, or is this a device that already fits into an existing built-in profile? What level of authorization am I going to apply to this new use case? Is it a already compromised smart device coming from a foreign adversary that I need to make sure that it's not going to become risky to the rest of my environment? Where am I going to apply the authorization? Will it affect existing policies? Should have made that one in red. Why? Because this is the most common issue. So we finish out a deployment, policy looks great, come back to help the customer do an upgrade a year later or 6 months later, we go to look at the policy, and the policy has all these different rules, and they contradict each other. Essentially, the order of operations within that policy matters. So think about that order and think about the process that you'll go through. The other piece to adopting and dealing with these new device types is going to be being able to establish a test plan. So being able to understand how you want to test and how you're going to deal with these new devices. More specifically, are you going to be able to do the same things you would do when they come straight out of the box and plug into the network? Do you have profiling enabled in a way that it can identify a device that's never been seen before, get profiled, and get online effectively? With that said, we're going to jump into policy, optimizing policy and enhancing security. I know I'm running a little bit behind, and I appreciate everyone's time. Got probably another 10 minutes left, and then we will finish things out. If you do have to drop at this point, feel free to. We'll make sure that attendees get a copy of the recording as well. So ISE policy evaluation kind of starts like this. We're connecting wired wireless VPN, coming into our authorization policy, where we're going to apply individual control to our sessions that are authenticating. Now, from here, we've got our policy construct. So what does that get built with? Policy sets. So a policy set is a way of compartmentalizing a policy for certain use cases. In some cases, an organization might choose to have a single policy set for all their wired and wireless use cases. If you start to get into a policy where you've got 30, 40, 50 rules, it might be hard to scroll through all of that. So in that case, many organizations will break out individual use cases, as you see here. My wireless devices are treated differently than my wired MAB devices, which are treated differently than my guests or contractors. And then the other thing that I kind of alluded to when talking about addressing new use cases like IoT devices is more specifically around the policy flow. So when we're looking at authentication, we have conditions, which is matching our authentication methods, where we should look for policy and how to handle failures. On the authorization side, we have individual rules that are going to match specific conditions there, assign an end result, which is called an authorization profile, and it also can assign a security group if we're leveraging segmentation. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind in the back of your mind as you're looking at policy. First match top down, just like a firewall. This is first match top down. One of the reasons why this is so important and highlighted, if you have your most popular role where you're getting millions of authentications per hour and it's the bottom rule out of 200, you probably are going to see some off latency because every time ISE is trying to evaluate one of those rules, it takes time. We're going to check into those external devices and systems before we allow access. And more in general, general best practices here, think about the complexity of policies. Most people don't try to get to that place where the policy becomes very difficult and complex to both manage, maintain, and then troubleshoot. But it does happen over time. So what ends up happening is you just dealt with your first IoT device, you added a rule, it works. Now you're on number 30 of brand new device types, and your rule base is so big, it's difficult to realize all of the challenges there. In general, think about trying to simplify as much as possible, and then utilize things like the library conditions and smart conditions to be able to label things more effectively within your ISE policies. Last tip on enhancing security specifically is I wanted to bring up this nice table that the Cisco team created around ISE authentication. So you more specifically can see you have different levels, everything from open access all the way to what we call 802.1x user plus machine. And that top strength value is something that is important. Why? Because in general, most organizations don't realize that this is a fully supported use case for managed Microsoft devices and Cisco ISE out of the box. So if you're going through an initial deployment or you're looking to enhance security in the future, TEEP is like my #1 recommendation for organizations. Why? Because up to this point, we might have a authentication that occurs. It's going to identify the machine or the user. With TEEP, we're able to take the combination of machine identity and user identity and be able to evaluate both as one. What does that give me? Well, it gives me the ability to essentially say this is a trusted user on a trusted device. All right, so for our last kind of tips and tricks around operations, I wanted to talk about enabling ISE engineers. So in general, when we're thinking about ISE expertise, obviously I realize not everyone's a triple CCIE and knows routing, switching, security, wireless, and all the other integrated technologies. And this is really the start of the problem. ISE is a single product, but it is a solution that integrates networking, security, identity, workstations, IoT, OT, compliance, integrations, quarantine, segmentation. All of those different use cases are different typical engineers and knowledge that has to be acquired or maintained. And in general, if I'm trying to do something like profile a printer, it's probably a lot different than profiling an HVAC system that sits on the operating technology side of the house. So understanding what you can do as an engineer, or if you're a leader, enabling your team, you got to think about the amount of information that's out there. So train versus hire, one of the things that I always tell different organizations, I try to be transparent about it. You know, when you're looking at maintaining ISE over time, well, you can start with the admin guide. That's 1,474 pages, and that's going to give you an idea of how to do everything. It's not going to tell you exactly how things go together, but it will tell you procedurally how to do everything. As I mentioned earlier, there's 157 pages just by itself to understand how to do a single upgrade and patch. So that knowledge is time within that engineer's day that they need to account for. One of the challenges that I see all the time is, you know, everyone has too much work to do. They don't have the time to take and prepare or learn new things as much. And in the case of leaders or managers, you should be telling your engineers, look, we care about the stability of ISE. You need to make sure you do the due diligence to understand how to do the upgrade, how to configure something appropriately. Also, you can look at more formal training options. So there is the Implementing and Configuring Cisco Identity Services Engine. This is a 5-day approved Cisco learning class. If you've never been through that class before, it takes you kind of 0 to 60. All of the general concepts of how ISE works, a lot of the top use cases, it's going to give anyone a good baseline of knowledge. Now that by itself, though, is typically enough to understand every knob inside of ISE for the most part, but there's still more information around things like .1x. 3-day introduction to 802.1x Cisco learning class is still around. That one does specifically cover IBNS 1.0 and some of the 2.0 information. But to give you an idea here, you could spend probably 5 days going into detail on how .1x works, how it can be customized and tuned to give better outcomes to end users and experiences. The last thing you have to think about is how much learning is enough. Does my engineer that's only responsible for upgrades need to go through a 5-day class? Probably not. Is he or she going to have to go through and take the time to prepare and read the documentation up in advance? Absolutely. How much experience is enough? If you're starting from scratch and you haven't deployed yet, like I mentioned in the beginning, make sure someone's got that experience so that they're not trying to deploy ISE for the first time in your production environment. That is the biggest no-no that I've seen way too many times. All right, so I will do this summary real quick and then we'll open it up for more of the Q&A. So just to summarize, new use cases, they're going to create a lot of the challenges in operations. How do I change ISE's configuration? How do I do it in a standard way that's not going to break other use cases? Making sure that you keep the solution up to date, making sure that you're performing that maintenance. If you had your brand new vehicle and you're supposed to get the oil changed every 5,000 miles and you don't change it for 45,000 miles, what's going to happen? There's no difference between that and installing software updates, patches, certificate maintenance. So keep that solution up to date, keep it in line within your organization. And then finally, make sure you have a good plan to create access to ISE experts, whether it's internally, externally, relationships within Cisco, etc. With that said, I wanted to do brief kind of overview of ModernCyber. I know many of you know us, have worked with us before in the past. A few of you have not. When we're looking at something like an ISE deployment, we like to always say Sherpas of that ISE journey. Meaning ISE has all the tools, everything you need to do to climb that mountain. In general, that journey is definitely one that's very unique to you. ModernCyber, we like to say we are the Sherpas. Even though we might not be seen in the process front and center, in some cases we are front and center in the process, but either way, we want to make sure you're able to go through that journey without the challenges of having to learn from scratch. Quick summary, we're based in Florida, but we actually have worldwide coverage. So more recently, we're actually on the Cisco GPL. So you can work with us through Mint Security Solutions. Anyone who has ever not heard of Mint before, it's essentially mentored installation and training. So whether it's a health check or ISE deployment, ISE optimization, essentially the way we do a lot of those services is try to help you understand and train the team as we're performing those day-to-day options and actions. And then finally, from an ISE lifecycle services, whether you're starting out or you're finishing, need some help with integrations, we're definitely there to help. I want to thank everyone again for their time today, and feel free to reach out if you have additional questions, want to talk about some of these topics a little bit more, and feel free to share some of the content with some of your coworkers and acquaintances there as well. Thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.